All right. Let's see. Damon, can you hear me? Can you type in the chat? How do I do this? Hey, wait. Kristin, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Hey. Yes, I can hear you. All right, cool. That's 2 for 3. And then Damon is here. Just need to figure out how to get him on the thing.
Yeah. Hello. Oh, hi, Christine. Hi, Jan. We've already got people chiming in. That's
good to see you.
And yay.
Yes, very good.
Where is Demand?
I saw him in the moderation panel thing that's down in the bottom, but I don't know how to get him to actually. Let me see. All right. Hey, Calvin.
Hey.
Here to help if you need any help with technical stuff.
Yes, Damon is here. I think he's in like a thing called a moderation panel, actually on the audio and video.
Who is the person that you were looking to connect with?
Damon's drummer.
Okay, and he needs to be up on the screen.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if we have him set up as a moderator, so we'd have to request it. Damon, if you can click the blue button to request that says share audio and video, it will come up on our end on the moderation panel side, and then we can approve that and get you up on the screen. Other than that, are we expecting this to just be a discussion, or are there any presentations that we're expecting during this?
It's going to be a discussion.
Okay, sounds good. Then no screen sharing issues, which makes my life easier.
Yeah, we're just going to be talking about biotechnology, obviously.
Great, I'm excited to hear the thoughts on that. Yeah, it's important. I'm excited to hear your thoughts on how SynBio can help and the ways that it can do better.
Yes, I think that's the second part is almost even more important.
Yeah, I agree.
So where is? Let's go to people. Hi, Keone. Okay, let's see.
Hey.
Is Damon still in here? Yes. Oh.
Hello.
Okay, I am inviting him to the video call. Maybe that'll work.
I think that may be something different.
Oh,
that might be like video call.
Okay, never mind. Ignore that, Damon. don't click that link. We'll probably both get kicked out. Apologies, folks. We're waiting for our third person to join us.
And the other sessions don't wrap up for another 5-10 minutes well, this isn't scheduled to start in for a while.
He's here. Hey.
Black screen. I should have just like jumped out and came back in. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Very exciting.
Seems like everyone's here. You all should feel free to start when you want. We're not scheduled for another 5 minutes, but this is just a discussion.
Yeah.
Whenever you all want to start, you feel free to.
Well,
I will be monitoring, and
okay.
but I will pop off the screen to let you talk.
I think we can definitely start sharing some resources. So I've got a fairly detailed outline of things we can talk about in the Google Doc, and I feel like I should share at least the summary of the policy paper that I wrote, so that people can have that as a reference if they want it. And I know, Calvin, could you get in contact with Kevin Costa? He said that he was going to make a poll for me in the polls tab that would allow me to. I want to try to gauge the temperature of the audience with respect to the climate crisis as the opening thing. And if we could get a poll going, that would be really useful. I mean, I suppose as long as we're waiting around, people who are already in here, if there are things that you would particularly like to hear us talk about, you know, if they're like burning questions or topics, we're happy to entertain those and adjust the planned schedule accordingly.
Let me see. All right.
Hey, Matthias, good to see you. Man, there's a good Sunrise Scientist crew in here.
Oh, cool.
Yes. Ron, yes, the sign is great. Oh my goodness. Whew.
Plastic waste. Okay. So 2 minutes away from starting, and still no sign of the poll.
We could maybe just have people post their response in the chat.
It could be less quantitative, but we can
Yeah.
get a sense at least.
Yeah, maybe.
Just see if I can call Kevin real quick.
Sweet.
I'm afraid Isaac has cracked the code on getting me to do something. It's like, hey.
Which is like just calling.
Oh, it's like an email, a formal ask, and then it's like, hey, this thing's happening in 2 hours. You in? It's like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, it's just that.
Like today was pretty open, so it turned out to be kind of open, so that worked out. It's hard for me to plan stuff these days, and so this was actually a really good time.
Yeah,
perfect timing.
I feel you. I learned about this morning when Isaac tweeted that he was going to be doing a panel with me, and I was like, is that a thing that I agreed to?
All right. Well, in my defense.
I was like, I guess I'm doing a panel today, but it's good because my meetings are like on the other side of this, not in the middle of it. So it worked out. It worked out.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually, one that everybody in this room will be interested in is the call I was just on was with a team at NREL, at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory.
Oh wow.
And we asked them, one of the questions that we asked them was, so in your approximation as a team that's trying to get some momentum around commercialization of some of the technologies you've been working on, which ones are the most ready? And I guess there weren't that many dissenters on the call, but the one person said, and everyone else agreed, it was like, oh, it's definitely the stuff that's happening in biology. So I thought that was really interesting. I was like, yes, amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited about that.
Yes. Great. Okay. I've used Matthias's suggestion and just created a fast poll that we can hopefully just access. All right, everybody. It is 4 o'clock, so we are going to get started on this. Before I have an outline of how we're going to do this, but before we start with introducing the panelists, I want to take everybody's temperature on something, on where you feel like we are as a civilization. So I'm going to outline 2 potential futures, the good future and the bad future, and ask you which one you think that we're more likely heading towards. So the bad future is a future where we do not decarbonize quickly enough, and we pass several tipping points in the climate system that cause irreversible feedback loops of warming. And as a result of this warming, we, as human civilization, are hit by devastating fires, floods, heat waves, famines, droughts, sea level rise that displaces hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, destabilizes and crashes the global economies around the world, and causes a political destabilization that leads to the essential collapse of liberal democratic order in favor of sort of authoritarian regimes that benefit from sort of xenophobia as a result of demonizing climate refugees. So that's a bad future. And then the good future would be we decarbonize quickly enough to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. We come to build a civilization that minimizes the material and energetic requirements for every human being to life while we balance with nature. Our economy becomes more like an ecosystem, cycling and valorizing all the materials in it, so it minimizes the requirements of resource extraction. And we address longstanding problems of economic, racial, social injustice. So my question for you, and the poll that I've posted in the chat I'd like you to answer, is with where we are right now, do you think that we are on a trajectory, in the absence of a major course correction, towards something that looks more like the bad future or something that looks more like the good future? And I'll give you a couple of minutes to click on the poll and answer that question. In the meantime, we'll do introductions. So I'm Isaac Larkin. I'm a graduate student at Northwestern in synthetic biology. I'm very excited about democratizing the means of biotechnological production. I'm a developer on the Free Genes project, which Keone Gandal leads up at the BioBricks Foundation. And for the past year and a half or so, I've also been an organizer in the Sunrise movement, pushing for this idea of a Green New Deal, a massive mobilization to decarbonize society and the economy and build a better and more just world in this place. And invite Kristin to introduce herself, and then Damon to introduce himself.
Can do. I think people are saying that the poll is not posted.
It's not. Yeah. Oh, did I post it? Sorry, I posted it only to Kevin Costa. Hang on. Yes, introduce, and I'll post the poll.
Okay.
Poll.
Sweet. Here. Amazing.
There we go.
Okay. So thanks for that, and thanks for the intro, and thanks for pulling this panel together, Isaac. I see a lot of friendly, well, not faces, but names in the chat. My name is Kristin Ellis. Currently, I'm an entrepreneur in residence with Carbon 180. They are a nonprofit that is working primarily, their core focus is on creating policies and reports and working with agencies to create regulations or help spearhead the creation of regulations and incentives around carbon removal. They used to be the Center for Carbon Removal, now they are Carbon 180, and the Entrepreneurship in Residence is their latest program. And I'm a part of that, and I'm really excited to be a part of that. So my background, I'm educated in biochemistry and molecular biology. I spent the last 5 years with Opentrons, as a lot of you know, building open source robots for scientists. And so I come to this from the perspective of, I do believe that biotechnology, biology is the greatest technology, that biotechnology can save the world. B, I believe that what is required to enable and empower that is sort of a everyman grassroots approach to the problem. So I think that the solutions to the problem are going to be many, that nothing is a silver bullet, and that the work has to come from the ground up. I think that the open source ethos and open science ethos is going to be very, very important in these movements and as we're developing these technologies. And I'm particularly interested in problem solving at the intersection of biotechnology and more traditional carbon removal technologies. The things that I've been investigating as an early part of this fellowship, because I'm still in the ideation phase, are things like self-re-expression of enzymes like carbonic anhydrases that can be deployed in different contexts or environments, and ways to sort of miniaturize and decentralize and distribute direct air capture. So that's kind of the way I've been thinking about this, but I'm still playing around with lots of ideas in my head. Very, very interested to hear, what everyone else is thinking about, where everyone else falls on the topic, and I'm gonna pass it to Demont.
Cool. Thank you. I'm Damon Drummer, co-founder and executive director of New Consensus. We're a new organization, relatively new. I think we're best known for our work on introducing this idea of a Green New Deal and helping to thrust it into the national conversation, and frankly, the global discourse as well. But what we do at New Consensus is really map out plans, transformative plans is actually quite simple. Transformative plans to actually solve problems that we're all dealing with is really, really simple. Yeah. So much of what's happening in the policy world is just nibbling around the edges of some bad decisions that we've made in the past. And what we're saying at New Consensus is that we can make a different set of decisions and change the trajectory of our whole society to one that is more sustainable, not just environmentally, but socially and economically as well. And so we're starting to see some of the fruits, as it were, of some of the bad decisions that we've made and our failure to actually make better decisions. So I'm trying to find more simple ways to talk about what we do, but that's what it is. Like we can make better decisions. And what I love about talking to scientists like Isaac and being on panels with folks like Kristin is that there's transformative thinking happening throughout all the sectors of our society. And part of our job is to find these thinkers and really be in conversation with them so that we can really show what's possible. Because I think one of the battles that we're really fighting here is a battle for the imagination of the American public. And I think scientists can help invigorate and inspire aggressive action. So happy to be here.
Yes, fantastic. All right, I just want to note, so far we've got 17 people who've responded to the poll, or now we're 18 people, and 83% of the respondents think that we are, as a civilization, on a track for the bad future. So I think that's important to internalize, that most of us feel like we're heading towards some sort of climate apocalypse or catastrophe, that like potentially within our lifetimes, things are going to get really, really bad unless things drastically change. So it's important, I think, to start this off, recognize that things are going to change radically, and they're either going to be changes that are forced by the catastrophes that come, crash upon us as a result of, the anthropogenic climate change, or they're going to be radical changes that are chosen with foresight to prevent as much warming as possible and to make civilization as resilient as possible to the warming that is inevitable. So with that, we can move on to sort of the first topic of conversation, which is how can biological technologies contribute to decarbonizing and to building a more resilient human civilization, especially in the context of this idea of a Green New Deal, a massive mobilization of public and private resources to combat the climate crisis and build a better world. Let's, Kristin, you work at a place that specializes in carbon drawdown. So why don't you get us started?
Oh gosh. Okay. And so the question is, how can, not what technologies, but how can technologies contribute? Right?
Yes. Like and biological technologies in particular.
In biological technologies in particular. So the thing, I love this question. And the thing that always comes to mind is that one, it's always, the first thing that always comes to mind is at a high level, it's that one slide that Jason Kelly always puts up where he's like, it's like the iPad and the iPhone and the whatever, the Google Home or whatever, and the houseplant on the table. And he's like, which one of these is the most sophisticated? And it's the houseplant, right? So when I think about biology and decarbonization, I think about the carbon cycle. I think about the fact that biology is literally the best at taking carbon from the air and converting it into biomass, into mass, into material, into things that now over millions of years have turned into the fuels that power our entire energy economy, into the materials that we make clothing and buildings and food, and literally everything sort of hinges on ancient biology or current biology. And the way I think about the deployment of biotechnology is not, a thing that I've learned anew as I start to move in the carbon tech space, where there aren't necessarily as many people in biology that I'm having conversations with. It's that when people hear synthetic biology or biotechnology, they're often thinking about like, oh, right, you guys that are like creating, you're creating whole new synthetic organisms from scratch, and you're gonna build, everything, rebuild everything from the ground up and make it more efficient. And I think yes, and also I think the way that biotechnology can be deployed most effectively is as an aid or an enhancement to existing natural systems to make them work better. I think a couple of gaps and things that we don't consider that I'm interested in exploring are things like, where do biotechnological enhancements overlap with things like ecosystem services? One of my favorite examples of this is the restoration of the Catskills watershed in New York State. And so I live in New York City. It's a crazy place right now, but we have amazing drinking water, and it all comes from the Catskills watershed in the northern part of the state. And so basically several years ago, they sort of sketched it out and they thought, okay, we can build a state-of-the-art water filtration facility that's going to cost us $600 million a year to maintain, or we can invest $1.5 to $3 billion. I think they ended up, it was somewhere around $2 billion they invested in the restoration of the Catskills watershed. And now all of the water that filters down into New York City is clean and just sort of passes through some UV filters before it makes it into my faucet for me to be able to drink. And that was largely done by investing a ton of money into the existing ecosystem so that we could rely on that fresh water supply. Now, there are a lot of ways about how that was done that have impacted communities that are not the New York City community, not the urbanized community, that weren't great and weren't done that equitably. I do think that whole project could have been done better, as with a lot of projects. But this is a really good example of working with the things that the natural environment already does to provide us with the things that we need while simultaneously reinvigorating and restoring and making sure that those ecosystems are not destroyed. And I think that there are some ways in which biotechnology and bioengineering can be used to enhance that. I love all the stuff that's going on with soil microbes. I love sort of all of the wild ideas out there about, you know, like taking carboxysomes from cyanobacteria and gene gunning them into the leaves of tobacco plants so the tobacco plants can take up more carbon. I think all of these are really interesting ideas. And that's where I'm interested, is where are the overlaps between what already works and what we can kind of tweak just a little bit to make it work better. I hope that was...
Yes, I mean, yeah, I think everything you were saying, completely agree, especially the stuff on ecosystem services. So I actually, I posted in the chat a policy briefing that I wrote for Damon. Damon commissioned me to write it for New Consensus about biotechnology and how it can contribute to decarbonization. And one of the things that was helpful for me in thinking through this sort of like very big problem and this very big field that is biological technology is like breaking it down by scale and by application. So you can think about using biology to do useful stuff at every scale, from like the molecular level to the cellular level, to the tissue level, the organism level, to the ecosystem level, to the biosphere level. And you can think about applying it in these different sectors, you know, like what are the things that you can make with biology? You can make medicine, you can make food, so that's like medical biological technology. You can make foods, that's agricultural biological technology. You can make materials, so that's industrial or white biological technology, which is a lot of what synthetic biology and metabolic engineering talks about. And then that last section that I think gets left off and not talked about or thought about enough, that critically important, ecosystem services, like ecosystem biology, like engineering things so that the natural living world becomes part of the infrastructure of human civilization and provides what we need and reduces the need to, you know, make a whole bunch of like concrete and expensive refined, you know, semiconductor and metal materials to perform a given task. Yeah. And I would say, you know, some areas that I would touch on to complement the stuff that you already talked about is in terms of ecosystem services as well. One thing that is not always recognized is how important like natural living ecosystems are for carbon storage. Like there are, so there's this project called Project Drawdown. It's an institute, sort of a think tank in and of itself, that looks at, you know, tries to quantify what different policy and programs, what effect they would have in terms of reducing carbon output of human civilization. And like far and away, the most effective thing like on their list is like land use reform, and basically just changing the way that humans interact with the land, and in particular like places that are, you know, quote unquote wild, to preserve the carbon that is trapped in those places and allow those places to draw down more carbon. It's like hundreds of gigatons a year they can potentially draw down. You know, I would say one thing that we haven't talked about as much is in agriculture, how do we engineer plants to store carbon? How do we engineer them to basically like grow more roots and become more like perennial crops instead of these annual crops that need to be sort of tilled every year that release soil carbon from the soil? So in general, like there are a whole range of solutions across scales and applications. And I think one thing that synthetic biologists should start thinking about is ways that they can connect to other scales of biological technology and applications of biological technology that we don't usually think about. Mm-hmm. And I think one other thing that I think you touched on a little bit is this idea of, you know, this public investment in these ecosystem service that's not going to return, you know, a massive amount of profit to any sort of like private investor, but it provides a massive public benefit, both in terms of like quality of life and economically. It pays for itself over time because you don't have to build this infrastructure. So one thing to think about in the context of mobilization is against climate change is that something that is highly profitable is not necessarily highly beneficial, and something that's highly beneficial is not necessarily highly profitable. And I see Matthias has a question for Demond. How do we set up a policy environment that can fund these sorts of public projects?
Question, and reading Isaac's memo, major recommendations is to demilitarize the funding stream for this type of research. I think it's interesting in this moment, like today, and what our country has gone through for the last week or so, where people are really pushing to say, hey, states and localities need to move money away from policing and into like human services, right? So people can flourish and we can actually invest in people versus doing all this incarceral kind of framework on the back end. The same logic applies to how do we fund research from the federal government perspective. If everything has to like have some sort of defense application, we're only going to get a certain type of technology with that reading. And then scientists are spending time and researchers are spending time trying to twist very interesting applications to have some sort of military application. And so let's just demilitarize our research funding. That's a really big recommendation. So that's all I have right now. But I think that's a really big conversation. And that is part of the reimagining of what this country can stand for, what this country can be, and how like policy and economics and how we think about America matters for scientific research.
Yes, 100%. So another like we can talk for a while about specific technological applications, but honestly, like it's easier to just sort of it's maybe more productive to just like we've surveyed some of them, and there are more that you can read about in the links that are being shared in the chat. But I think since we're all here together, even more important than like these talking about specific applications is talking about what should we practitioners of biological technology be doing collectively and individually in order to organize and build the power required to actually implement the kinds of massive programs that are required to decarbonize and build a sustainable civilization in time to stave off this like climate-induced collapse. So on that front, like I think it's really important to talk about, what is the history of like public government-led economic mobilization? What are they capable of? And I think Demond, you in particular, would be able to speak to like what is the history of this country in terms of being able to mobilize to meet an existential challenge.
There's and it's interesting. I think we go back to consistently, although it had very grave consequences for releasing carbon into the atmosphere, was the industrial mobilization for World War II. The idea was that the U.S. did not have at the time, this was like in the early 40s, did not have a military industrial complex as we know it today. And being the number one and primary and frankly the sole client for military hardware, the federal government invested in the country's industrial capacity to produce tanks, helmets, bullets, bombs, and ships, etc. Matter of fact, one of the foremost health insurance companies, Kaiser, started out as a shipbuilding company, right, during the World War II mobilization, right? So, the history of this country is full of decisions that we made as a public to use the might of our government and to use public dollars and all of the kind of dynamism and capacities of the private sector as well, bridge these two things together and transform what this country does. And so a country that did not have much of a military industrial complex was a leading provider of the material to win World War II. Now, just to be clear, the U.S. obviously did not win World War II all by itself, right? And there were other countries also producing things, but we did our part, right? And so, yes, the U.S. cannot fix the climate crisis all by ourselves, but we can certainly do our part, right? And be helpful to other countries as well and not be a roadblock. And so I think the World War II mobilization is probably the best example that we have of this country moving and doing something it had not done before. Another one is the New Deal, where we created as a society entirely new frameworks for government action in the life of this country. We had the federal government stepping in to back mortgages. Up until that point, you had to have a ton of money to buy a house. But we made a decision as a country to allow white people to buy homes, right? And then everybody else was like, you could figure it out, right? And the list goes on and on and on. The farm credit system, right? The land grant institutions, which was prior to New Deal. I mean, all of this stuff are part of the mechanisms that we created as a society, where our government was a vehicle, a tool to breathe life into our economy and to shape and extend, outcomes for farmers, workers, et cetera. Right now, it seems like we have this strange controversy with ourselves, where we see government as the enemy. Even people who consider themselves on the progressive side of the political spectrum still see government as an uninnovative, stagnant, ossified shell of what it once was, when indeed it is the public sector, fully a third of the economy, right? It is the public sector that is, I would argue, the flywheel of our economy. What's propping up our economy right now, right? The public sector, right? So, what is responsible for 80% of the technology in an iPhone, right? Direct government research, right? So, just reminding people that this is the actual story of this country, and we can apply that same might, that same dynamism, those same capacities to address this climate crisis, and do so in a way that radically includes folks who have been actively shut out. Again, every phenomenon that we witness and experience today in this country is from a series of decisions that we've made as a society, right? So you don't get the hood without government intervention. You don't get the iPhone without government intervention. And government intervention requires decisions that the public makes, and we need to make better decisions.
Fantastic. So let's talk about, all right, let's say, all right, we are biotechnologists, and we want to organize and fight for the passing of this massive, aggressive, muscular, and innovative government policy, this massive program of decarbonization on the scale of the New Deal or the World War II mobilization. Who are our political allies in that struggle, and who should we be building bridges to and connecting with and mobilizing with and showing up for, in order to build a coalition that's big enough and powerful enough to actually win power and start implementing these kinds of changes?
Do you want to kick off with some thoughts? Because I know you're part of a group that is doing some of that, and I can riff off. No, I think as a scientist starting there, and then I can fill in and add in from there. Because that's a key question that I think you would be really good at.
Yes. Okay. So I told you guys that I joined the Sunrise Movement about a year and a half ago. And what that is, it's a youth-led grassroots organization that's fighting for implementing this idea of a Green New Deal. And the thing that I think makes the Green New Deal as a concept, if not as a brand, the thing that is most likely to get us to a good future is that it sees the crises of our time, the climate crisis, the crises of political and economic inequality, the crises of historical and ongoing social and racial injustice. These are all intertwined, and they all feed on each other and reinforce each other. And so the Green New Deal says, all right, the only way that we are going to get out of the trajectory to the bad future is if we build a coalition of all of the people, justice and for each individual aspect of each of those crises. We need to build and see the connections between those crises and how they reinforce each other. For instance, environmental justice is a racial justice issue. Like, African Americans in this country suffer from asthma and die from asthma at rates that are significantly higher than white people because polluting factories and industries and brownfield sites and sacrifice zones are disproportionately cited in African American communities. And that's just one example. Like, the indigenous communities in this country have been systematically dispossessed of their land and their sovereignty, and they need the fight to restore indigenous sovereignty and rights and dignity is also the fight to keep carbon trapped in the ground, because the indigenous communities will they are not going to support, turning their sort of their homelands into these sacrifice zones where you extract where you basically poison the ecosystem and extract massive amounts of raw materials or natural resources from them. So we need to start seeing these struggles as connected, and we need to start showing up for the other people, for the people who are fighting these other struggles, and start building connections to them, and start integrating our vision of what a good future it looks like and how we can contribute to that with our specialty in biological technology, and start contributing from the perspective of how do we build a common and shared vision with all of these other people and all of these other communities, and how do we all sort of push in the same direction so that when there is a crisis that opens political opportunity to actually implement stuff, we're ready to go. It's sort of like a reverse of what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine. The shock doctrine is where basically like very powerful corporations and sort of neoliberal politicians, when there is a disaster, like for instance, Hurricane Katrina, they take advantage of the chaos of the disaster when nobody's really paying attention to what's going on to pass pass all of the policies, implement all the policies that they want, like school privatization, privatization of public services, all of these things. We need to be ready with our vision and our plan so that when the time comes, we are prepared to build with our coalition and push through our vision of the good future and the policies required to get there.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear what Demond has to say, but I just wanted to chime in terms of indigenous land management, it's not just the not extracting, not raising those lands. It's the fact that those lands, because they have been under indigenous management, actually have more capacity to draw down and sequester and hold carbon. And this has been quantified scientifically, right? And it's this idea that like, sort of an opening of the idea, right? So I think this also calls back to a question where it's like, how do you, who asked? Stephen asked, he said, I'd like to hear you talk about ways that some of the novel uses of biotech can be normalized in a population that has a degree of skepticism about the fundamental goodwill of tech companies. I kind of want to turn that on its head a little bit and say that there's kind of a conversation that needs to be had where we are not going in presuming that we have the answers just because we have biotechnology. And I do see some of this happening. And I think there's sort of a propensity for different groups, especially groups armed with technology, to say that the technology is going to save us. But I think that there's some of this that's already been going on that we can learn from. For instance, like there's a guy named Joseph Priestley, who is a sort of a multi-hyphenate white dude, English white dude, and is credited with the discovery of the carbon cycle. That's bullshit. He did not discover the carbon cycle. He might have been the first person to scientifically, in Western terms, quantify the carbon cycle, but he did not discover anything, right? And so there are these deep wells of knowledge that already exist in communities. And I think if we reach out, extend the olive branch, and instead of saying, this is the technology that will save you, we kind of open the channel to say, we want to listen and learn how you've been doing this and then see where what we're building might fit within that or intersect with that or add a puzzle piece to that puzzle. I think that'll be a much better way to engage with the technology that we're developing and actually help us develop it in a context that isn't going to continue to decimate populations that are disadvantaged. I'm not a political operative. That's just sort of,
No, I think that perspective, Kristin, is fundamental. As you were talking, Kristin, I was reminded of the civic tech movement that emerged in the early decade. And what we saw was folks who knew how to write code and can analyze data and would go to communities in the hood and say, hey, I have the answers for you. And that was not the right approach. And I had spent my time at that time kind of playing interface between these two communities, the tech community and a geographic community on the south side of Chicago, and finding ways to work together with each other's capacities. And so I think that's a very interesting point, Kristin, about not assuming that one has the solutions. I think another thing, and I don't have much to say about, well, I'll offer this. I always say I don't have much. I got to stop saying that. Anyway, I want to be humble by saying, I think scientists play an extremely important role, and people doing research play an extremely important role. I think one thing that you could do like right now, particularly in light of, this Black Lives Matter moment that we're in, which is deeper than Black Lives Matter, because if Black Lives Matter, like, we just have a better country for everybody, we'll just, I won't go into that. That's a different panel that's not on this, that's not at this conference. But, it's important to know that everything is political and that everything that we do exists within a political economy. So being conscious and aware of the externalities of the work that you're doing, understanding what makes you come alive, what you're passionate about, the role that you can play in moving the society forward, and thinking much more deeply, much more critically about how you can be part of fighting this fight on your flank and on your front, right? I think that's a direly important thing. The answer is not to go become an organizer and find a group and really try to interface. I think it's being aware of what the fight is and seeing how your work either advances or helps that fight or is working against that fight. And I think it's very narrow, right? I know science is very narrow. You have your narrow thing. And so just kind of looking beyond just the immediate application of your research and thinking about the political and economic context in which that application may be happening, and figuring out who you need to be talking to understand the ethical and economic dimensions of what you're working on and how they actually might be a proposal or recommendation for funding for another group, And so it's really more finding some folks who can help inform how you're thinking about your work. And that is a very huge step that you can take. And I think Isaac might have some ideas on like how to actually take those steps.
Yeah, I did organize the Scientists Caucus within the Sunrise Movement, which is basically, so if you are a scientist and you're interested in this sort of getting plugged into the mobilization of the Green New Deal, there are ways to do that that get you connected to these different movements for justice and expose you to these types of things. One last thing I want to say on the what should we as biotechnologists do point is we should be thinking about where can these policies start to be implemented now. Because they're clearly the current U.S. federal government is not going to dismantle the fossil fuel industry and replace it with green technology, including biological technology, in a massive mobilization. But there are other countries, there are states, California is clearly planning a green stimulus. That's what this summit is about. But there are entire countries, South Korea has committed to a massive green stimulus to jumpstart its economy after the pandemic. Spain is doing something similar. So we should be, one of the things is the biotechnology community is international. And so we should be thinking about where can we connect to other nations and other governments and start to try and testing out the implementation of these things that we've been talking about, both at the technological and the social and the activism level, so that when the time comes, we're ready to implement them in places that like the United States. So we're running a little short on time, but I do want to get to how should the practice of biological tech, we've talked about technical solutions that biotech can provide. We've talked about ways that biotechnologists could organize. Given the coalition we need to build, how should the practice of biological technology change in the process of mobilizing against these global crises, whether it's COVID-19 or climate change? And so there's been a lot of talk at this conference about open source, open sharing, and development of technology. I've been involved with the Free Genes project for a few years now, and I think we should be thinking about how do we as biotechnologists, how do we earn the trust of environmental justice communities, indigenous communities, other allies in the fight for a livable future? Let me throw it to Kristin. Ideas. Because there was a question earlier about, how do we convince the public to adopt these technologies? And I think a better way of framing that is, how do we earn the trust of communities that are skeptical by showing up for them, and also by thinking harder about, are there ways that we should change the way we practice the biotechnology?
Yeah, I have a lot of views on this. I have to preface this with, I have a lot of views on this that don't necessarily mesh with the reality of how the system is set up to found and fund technology companies, right? So it is actually immensely challenging, as a person who spent a significant amount of time doing it, to form a company that is based on open source technology, especially when a lot of research goes into upfront, a lot of dollars go into upfront actually bringing that to market, bringing it to commercialization. But I do think that we could potentially radically reframe the idea, the way that we think about things. I mean, Demond held up the iPhone earlier and was like, 80% of this was funded by the government. If it was funded by the government, it was funded by the public. Why then is Apple a $1 trillion company and they hold the patents to frickin' everything in the iPhone? I mean, I understand that, like, there's a profit motive and free market and all of that stuff, and I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole right now. But what I think is that there needs to be potentially, as we move into the climate space, some innovation on the business model front. We actually need to be thinking more critically, not just about the technology, but about the ways that we're commercializing and deploying it, and about the business models that we can surround it with in order to ensure that it's deployed in an equitable manner. One of the books I've been reading recently that's really, really great is called Everything for Everyone. And there are emerging economies in the world that are 70% cooperative, right? Like the 70% of the businesses are co-ops, they're worker-owned collectives. They're not these top-down funded entities. So I think that's one thing. I think there's a way that we can be more transparent about the transfer of technology and the formation of businesses and innovation around business models that might help. I don't know if we have time to go into specifics on that, but I do recommend that book. And then another thing I think is literally, I'm going to go back to just the talking to people. One of the things that always pops into my head is having conversations with my mom when I started learning science. And she would always say things like, oh, that's so interesting. I'm too dumb to understand that. I'm too dumb to understand that. She graduated high school and didn't go to college. And then next thing I know, I'm like encouraging, I'm like, no, of course you can understand this. I'm just not using accessible language to talk to you about it. There's something in the way that we sort of academicize, that's not a word, but we make things sound a lot more complex and complicated than they actually are. Yeah. We can use normal language to talk about these things. We don't have to get tied up in our technical jargon. And I think we can work harder to meet people where they are. So for instance, I related to, she loves plants, she loves gardening. I started talking to her, this was a long time ago, about Kira Havens and her old company Revolution Bio, and how she wanted to make flowers that would change color when it rained. She wanted to make biotech more beautiful. And that resonated with my mom. And then she went out and learned about GMOs. And then she came to me and was like, I don't understand why everyone's so worked up about GMOs. They seem pretty cool. Because she on her own went and learned about all this technology and was telling me about it. And so I think it's just, you find the entry points, you find the things that people relate to. You don't go and beat them over the head with like, but I have the answer and this is the technology. And by the way, I'm going to cover it up in patents and hide it behind paywalls. And yes, you're not going to be able to have access to it or know how it was made, but trust me, it's totally fine, right? So there are a lot of fundamental things that I think we need to move the needle on. And I totally believe we have the capacity to do so.
Yes,
sorry,
totally.
That felt like a rant, but
yeah, it was a good rant. So there's a lot more that I wanted to get to talking about. We're running out on time, and I think more important than me talking at you guys is I want you to not just like go away from this conversation and like, you know, think about it for a while and then forget about it. So I've posted a couple of links in the chat. There's a spreadsheet and there's a form. And I'd like you, if you're willing, to fill out basically your name, your contact info, what you think biotechnology should be doing collectively to organize and fight for a good future, and what you yourself would be willing to do. And hopefully, if we get a few people, enough people filling out their vision and their resolution, we can nucleate something and start to build and organize and make something blossom from this conversation. So I'd very much like you guys to do that. And I guess while you guys are clicking on that and filling that out, I'll just close this by saying, there are a couple of points that I wanted to get to. It's both the morally and the pragmatically correct thing for us to be massively transferring the technological advances of the developed world to the developing in the third world, particularly green technology and biological technology. We need to be just sharing all of that immediately, transferring that to these countries because, number one, they've been exploited for centuries and decades by colonial and neo-colonial resource extraction and oppression. And number two, they need to industrialize in a way that is not carbon intensive. And the only way they're going to do that is with like cutting edge advanced green and biological technologies. So they need that technology now. We should be transferring it to them now. And the last thing I'll say is a lot of environmentalists have concerns, and even people within the coalition that we should hope to join have concerns about moral concerns about patenting life and moral concerns about treating living things merely as tools to be substrates, to be engineered. And I think that we should be thinking about ways that we could change the practice of biological technology to respect and have a sort of reverence for living things and a gratitude for the living things that we, even as we're engineering these living things that are providing these services. And like, I don't know if I have the time for this, but I have sort of there are two metaphors that I like for describing life. Life is a 4 billion-year-old advanced alien nanotechnology that's powered by the sun and that can draw down carbon dioxide and make food, medicine, and materials. Alternatively, living things, our kin, our teachers, they bestow us with immeasurable amounts of wisdom and gifts of things that sustain us, and they should be treated with gratitude, respect, and even reverence. And I think a sustainable human civilization will recognize that both those metaphors are true. And I think with that, we're more or less out of time.
Yes, very good. Thank you guys so much. I'm just, yes, very, very awesome. And thanks everybody for joining.
Yes, and please, if you can, fill out that form, fill out that spreadsheet, and I will try. I've made a big push to finish my dissertation in like the next week or so, but after that, I will try to reach out and get some organizing going.
Awesome.
Yeah, I learned so much. This was so fun.
Yes, thanks so much for joining.
Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah.
Yes,
sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Oh, am I not pressing the button right? Hold on.
I don't know if I am either.
It was great meeting you, Kristin. I hope we can connect on the back end.
Yes.
Yeah, I love your points there. I think we're still live, so this was great.
Yeah, very great to meet you, and thank you so much.
For sure.